episode of the Atlas Society Asks. My name is Richard Salsman. I'm one of the 4 PhD senior scholars at the Atlas Society, and the Atlas Society is the leading nonprofit organization introducing young people to the ideas of Ayn Rand in very creative ways, really, such as through animated videos and graphic novels. Now, this is the first in a series of things we're trying periodically at the Society in a series known as Atlas Society Asks, but here it's Scholars Ask Scholars. And we have 4 senior scholars at the Society, thanks to the inspiration and efforts of Chairman Jay Lapierre and President Jennifer Grossman and the great team they have. So we're building intellectual capital here. And 3 decades ago, my guest today, David Kelley, began the Atlas Society, and it's just been an enormously valuable venture, I think, with its ups and downs, I'm sure he'll admit, but where we stand today, it's just fabulous. It's got a unique approach to objectivism and collegiality. I'm honored to be a part of it, and along with the others, Stephen Hicks, Jason Hill, Rod Trzynski, and others. So I am delighted today and honored to be able to spend an hour with David Kelley about the things that he most values, about his intellectual development, about his founding and promotion of the Atlas Society, his amazing, really amazing, unique role in objectivism, and his present views on the present state of the society and the future. Now, quickly, some of you may not know, it's worth mentioning, David earned his PhD at Princeton in philosophy in 1974, and he taught for many years at great schools like Vassar College and Brandeis University up in Boston. First time I came across David, I was reading Barron's magazine. He wrote dozens of really fabulous essays for Barron's in the late 70s and early 80s. He's also written many technical articles in academic journals, and 5 important books. Let me name them. The Evidence of the Senses, which is a realist theory of perception. That's 1986. I believe that came out of David's dissertation. 1996, Unrugged Individualism, the Selfish Basis of Benevolence. 1998, A Life of One's Own, Individual Rights and the Welfare State. 5 editions of a logic textbook called The Art of Reasoning, a really fabulous textbook. That's it. I have it. I don't know if you can see it. And Truth and Toleration in Objectivism, the Contested Legacy of Ayn Rand, in 3 different editions. Now, David, I know you formerly retired, allegedly, a few years ago, but I have known few younger intellectuals who are as busy as you are, as productive as you are. So I don't even, you've ruined the concept of retirement. I have no idea what it means anymore. But thank you so much for taking your time to join us in your so-called sleepy retirement. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you, Rob. I'm sorry, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here. And yes, retirement, like many people who say they're retired and maybe formally went through, leaving a salary job. Very few people I know, from my father on down through many, many friends, actually sit still. And I don't play golf, so.
Let's start at the beginning, David, or what I consider to be the intellectual beginnings. How did you, first of all, where did you grow up and how did you get interested in philosophy? And specifically, the hardest part of it, really, I mean, epistemology. It's got to be like one of the hardest parts of this. How did you get interested?
Well, I grew up in outside Cleveland, Ohio, suburb on the east side called Shaker Heights, which had a very good school system. That's why my parents moved there.
Yeah.
And I guess the reason I got interested, or the way I got interested in philosophy, my family belonged to a Presbyterian church. And when I was, 13 or 14, whatever, we had, was time that's when confirmation took place, like,
right,
of a bar mitzvah. And but anyway, we had a class meeting every Wednesday night, just the people who were in this class. And we got talking about a lot of issues in the Bible. And at some point, it occurred to me, that I just began thinking about them philosophically. One question in particular, and this was something that another student asked, you know, Jesus often talks as if suffering is a good thing, turning the other cheek, you know, and so forth. He said, what's good about suffering? I thought, that's a really great question. Yeah. And so I ran with that a little bit. But in addition to thinking, it got me thinking, how did she know to ask that question? Where did that thought come from? And so I began thinking, I just went, you know, from one issue to the other. I became an individualist early on. The only ultimate goal that made sense to me was pursuit of happiness. And I was an atheist. And then at some point, I came across Ayn Rand. And it turns out my parents had a copy of the Fountainhead, the first edition, I think, on their bookshelf. So I began reading. And then that was it. I read everything else. I was just astounded. How I got interested in philosophy, well, I was already thinking along philosophical lines. I didn't know that's what it was called. Yeah. But when I had to pick a college, I thought, well, what are subjects I like? I like English because we talk about real issues there, life issues, ethical issues. Yeah. But I also like math and science because that's method. That's how you can actually assemble the evidence and support a conclusion. And I thought, well, is there anything that combines those? And, you know, philosophy is the answer. So I decided even before I went to college that that's what I wanted to major in. Epistemology, it just always interested me how the mind works. I mean, going back to, you know, asking that question about the confirmation class question, where did that question come from? Right. Yeah. And I guess I've always been, you know, somewhat introspective, watching my own mind. It just was so interesting. And, you know, my senior year in high school, I just spent a lot of time reading in philosophy, not all epistemology, the history of philosophy, John Locke's second treatise. I was originally a little bit. So anyway, when I was in college, I liked the courses on epistemology the best. So I stuck with it.
You know, sometimes I've heard it said that when you're an undergrad, you learn how to ask the right questions. And then a graduate student is supposed to be able to answer them.
That's good.
Whether that's true or not, whether they teach it that way. Now, were you undergrad at Princeton as well, or as the PhD? Or
no, I was an undergrad at Brown University.
Brown, that's right. So pretty good pedigree there, Kelley. You must have been a smart kid. That's just fabulous. Now, Richard Rorty, who was your chairman, right, on the committee for your dissertation, is he fair to say he was a prominent philosopher, but also leans in the direction of postmodernism? So how did you work with him? I mean, was he a pronounced postmodern when you were with him? Was he helpful to you? Was he a barrier? How would you describe the relationship?
Well, it was
dissertation done.
Yeah, it was very positive. We argued all the time. And I was writing it in epistemology about sense perception and the foundations of knowledge, and he didn't believe there were foundations. So he was kind of in transition. He had begun reading a lot of Heidegger and Dewey, but not as fully postmodern as he was, you know, later on. He was still kind of in the analytic philosophy mode that was, you know, the dominant school at the time. That's the approach that most of my courses really liked him. I think it was maybe the first year I saw that he was going to be teaching a graduate course called Idealism from Bradley to Quine. And I thought, holy cow. Bradley was this 19th century British idealist that almost no one reads anymore. Quine was the logician.
Right.
And I said, if he could see I could see the connection because I'm an objectivist. They're both primacy of consciousness at deep level. But that's the kind of thinking I learned from objectivism, not from philosophy. And I said, if he can see that kind of abstraction and deal at that level, I want to be in his class.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
And then he accepted my request for him to be my thesis advisor. And he was very good. I mean, we disagreed all the time, but it was always he was a good teacher and also a great supporter when I was looking for a job afterwards.
I've met many professors like that, and I had the same attitude, partake in their brilliance and set aside the content if necessary. And it might have influenced your subsequent view on collegiality, David, and how you deal with people who are not in your orbit quite, so to speak. Now, since Evidence of the Senses was, I think, published in 1986,
right?
Talk a little bit about the transition from the dissertation to the book. Did it change much? Were you becoming more objectivist during the transition? There were a number of years in between, right? Or not, between the dissertation and the book. So how much of it did you change? How much did it become more objectivist as it entered publication? What was the story behind the ultimate publication of the book?
Well, when I was in grad school working on my thesis, I had to, anchor or at least deal with a lot of the other people in the field who had written on my subject. Yeah. And there were some people that Rory really liked a lot. I didn't like much, but he wanted me to write a chapter on Wilfrid Sellers, Quine, and when I finished the thesis and then began working at Vassar, I knew that I wanted to turn this into a book. I mean, the central idea of innovation in my thesis was an idea I had as an undergraduate, and I fleshed it out, and I wanted to write a book about that. But I knew I had to get away from being embedded in that analytic framework. Yeah. And I was fortunate in a couple of informal seminars he was teaching in New York, where I was living at the time. And he talked about something called delousing, getting rid of the academic lice in your hair.
Yeah. And including David, the jargon that you and I know. Yeah. It's just, I call it graduese. The language you have to use is performative more than it is clarifying. But yeah,
exactly.
The book is technical, but when I read it, it was understandable. I mean, you had to really concentrate, but I think you did take out a lot of the graduese. Do you feel that you did? Yeah,
I think so. It's interesting for anyone who's in philosophy now and maybe listening to this. One of the big tasks that I had was I was an objectivist. I wanted to write about the objectivist theory of perception in detail. I had been trained and steeped in and had to write for a different analytic philosophy audience. Yeah, and so it took me a while before I felt I could be truly bilingual. And put those two contexts in the same ballpark and let my context talk to theirs. And that's why one of the reasons it took 10 years before I got the book out. So yeah.
I remember reading the chapter on the primacy of existence. It's just fabulous. And yet that's really from metaphysics. But it's absolutely foundational for what you said in the rest of the book. And I'm just a broad picture now, David. Would you say your subtitle was A Realist Theory of Perception? Right. At the time it appeared, this was a minority view. The realist view, was that a minority view or just not fully fleshed out view in the field?
There was nothing I was aware of that was anything like the view I was presenting.
Yes.
All right. And, really, I was building on Rand's shoulders here. And that, by the way, that first chapter is one that I wrote just for the book. It was not my thesis.
Yeah.
But anyway, the realism at the time, it meant different things to different people. Most of the people who were writing about perception were what I call representationalists. They thought the immediate objects of awareness were inside our heads.
Right.
Instata ideas, Lockean ideas.
So we were perceiving not reality, but images of reality. So we were one step removed.
Exactly.
And then you start getting, then there's optical illusions and you can't be sure of your senses, sense perception, something like that, right? And you were trying to prevent that.
Right. So I had whole chapters on, I had one whole chapter on representationalism and the arguments for it.
Yeah.
And then, but a lot of people would call themselves realists because they might have had that belief about the inner objects of perception, but they thought there was an external world.
Right.
Most of the philosophers at that time, I don't think were postmodern idealists who just said everything's a text or anything like that. But they do all these minutiae about how we know about an external world, what the inferences are, and so I had to deal with all the arguments. But once you clear that framework out of your head, it becomes much clearer.
I remember when I met you in, I think, 1985 at La Jolla, and you were lecturing on parts of this, and the diaphanous model of awareness was being eviscerated by Dr. Kelley, and I was just bowled over. And it was just amazing because, David, that was a general audience. I mean, there was an intelligent layman, but just amazing material. Also, some great lectures I recall you doing on free will, validating of volition. Now, if one reads Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology here today, mostly about concept formation, right? Isn't it true in the beginning that sequencing from sensations to percepts to concepts, she kind of just stipulates the evidence of the senses are valid, right? She doesn't go into it in depth. So are you feeling like your book really contributes an important part of the foundation? I mean, if concepts are based on percepts and percepts on sensation, if you don't have the evidence of the senses, the link is lost. So how would you place the book, relative to Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology?
Well, I think Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology dealt with concepts, which is the single most important issue in epistemology. But, then we have to say that the aspects she did not develop were what concepts are based on, namely perception.
Right.
And at the other end, how concepts are formed into propositions that become true or false. What is that about? Yeah. And I do think that the book adds something substantive to objectivism. In fundamental terms, the primacy of existence was her concept. That's the realist basic idea. And even the idea of the form of perception, which I developed in some detail, came from her. I learned it from Leonard, but I think that was her idea. There was one of the things about objectivism is that, there's now a lot of written literature, but at the time, going back to the 60s and 70s, the amount that was actually written was just a small fraction of the oral tradition of things that were discussed in seminars and lectures and so forth. So anyway, so some of those basic concepts definitely came from Rand. I didn't invent them, but what I did was I think flesh them out, define the terms, show how they apply, answer objections, and then make a beginning in the evidence of the senses to, okay, we have perception now. We have some concepts. what is the actual nature of what's in philosophy or epistemology is called the justification of statements like, this is a sheet of paper, or that's Richard. Well, that's more complicated. But yeah.
And even something like analytic synthetic dichotomy, which Peikoff took apart, which I think is usually added as an appendix to Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology.
Right, yeah.
That I remember reading that 3 times before I understood it. But that's the kind of thing that strikes me, David. That's the kind of thing that you and Leonard and others did, where I don't think she could have done that. Not because she wasn't smart and not because she didn't have a valid theory of concepts, but you and the other objectivist philosophers also know intimately the history of philosophy, and
right.
Kant and what's sometimes called Kant's gimmick and all that kind of thing. And therefore, to be able to take apart and understand something like the analytic synthetic strikes me as it's an application of objectivism to a controversy in philosophy that really needs to be dealt with. And if it's not dealt with, the corpus can't be considered complete. I wonder if you think that as well. And you've come up with other things like that, where if you didn't do it, no one else was really going to do that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That when we think about open objectivism and what additions are made by other people, Leonard's essay is a good example. I think Rand, saw through that dichotomy, less instantly, and was, didn't think it was an important issue. It was too obvious.
Right.
There are a lot of things she thought, well, it's too obvious.
Right. Yeah. But
my grad students can write it up, but
right. And she probably helped him with the essay, but to have not just a foot, but 2 feet in academia, and to know, well, okay, Miss Rand, this may be clear as a truck to you, but you got to believe these people are just, getting all caught up in their own underwear, and it may sound silly from afar, but this is what's holding back philosophy. So it has to be done. Great, David. The comments on Evidence of the Senses, it's such a fabulous book. I recommend anyone who hasn't read it, absolutely.
Thank you.
Read it. It's fabulous. I love that. I love the backstory on it. Now, did you like academia? Did you like teaching? Academic life, or?
At first I did. Yeah. Getting a job and actually earning a salary was like amazing to me. I spent
they're paying me to be an epistemologist.
Right. I was living on I could tell you what my grad stipend was in my first salary, but unless you know the inflation stats really well,
don't say the number. People won't understand the inflation adjusted part. But I heard. Did you say somewhere? I think I read it in the intro. The Art of Reasoning, the great logic textbook you have, came out of your Vassar lectures. I mean, you were teaching logic at Vassar.
Yeah.
That book probably would not have been possible had you not repeatedly taught logic at Vassar, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Improved it every semester, that kind of thing. Is that the story of Art of Reasoning?
Yeah. When I went to Vassar, there was a woman, a logician from MIT who had been hired just previously to me. And at one meeting we were talking about the next year's courses. And she said, well, I've got all these people, all these students in my logic classes. They don't care about the logic per se. And she meant the analytic, the mathematical thing. Yeah. They want to learn how to think better. And she said it with a kind of disdain. So I said, how about a course for those people? I'd love to teach that. So we did. And I taught it, I think, starting my second year, though, every year I was there. And yes, that is how the logic textbook came about. But in somewhat indirect way, because I had, there were a couple of objectivist students, I think from Davidson, actually, down in your neck of the woods.
Yeah.
And who got in touch with me, and they said they wanted to set up a kind of private tutoring.
Right.
And so I worked with them. And then the young woman went to work for W.W. Norton, the public.
Right.
And everyone at Norton starts as what they call a traveler, a salesperson,
Right.
going around to schools and everything. And she got bored with that and wanted to advance to editing. So she thought, if I bring a book in, I can do it. So when she showed me the number, I had no idea what the finances of textbooks were. When she started showing me some of the numbers, I said, count me in, I'll do it.
Yeah. Yeah. If this thing takes off, you can make some money doing. Yeah. It's in 5 editions, David. Anything beyond the 3rd edition is a stupendous success. I think I have 3 of the 5 editions. A couple of years ago, I literally sat down and looked at the differences between them. And I can only tell they got better. You change certain things, they got better. The stuff on logical fallacies is good as well. Another just great book, and I have the latest one in paperback. It's not too expensive, but buy the expensive ones as well. Maybe you still get royalties. It's a fabulous book. And you're still in touch with the co-author, right?
Oh yeah, Debbie Hudgens and I have become fast friends, and I found out that actually she has kind of a secret objectivist background. She was a big fan of Ayn Rand in high school, and got all her college and grad faculty said, don't ever mention that.
Right. Yeah. It's often said that if you want to learn something,
and but you want now to she's teaching Ayn Rand in her ethics.
Yeah. It's often said that if you want to really learn something, teach it. So I'm curious whether in all your writings and teaching, did you become a better thinker just teaching it? Did you become a better thinker because you focused on epistemology, you think?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, that's common statement. You know something when you have to teach it. I found that in spades when I began teaching. And that's what made teaching exciting for the first, 4 or 5 years. Pick up a new topic, inventing a new topic for a course. But then, being creative in course structure and so forth, but also just being able to explain things that I knew and I could pass an oral exam on in grad school, but having to teach it to undergraduates. Why was Thales a significant philosopher? Everything is water.
Right. Yeah.
So, but what happened, I think, was that I kind of got burned out on teaching. I stopped learning as much, and from teaching, so I stopped learning as much from my students. And I realized at some point that there really are 2 kinds of teachers. There are scholars who teach as a means to be able to do research and write and inquire.
Yes.
Then there are people who are essentially teachers who love pedagogy, who love the task of figuring out how best to you get ideas across to their students, train them to advance their thinking, and they in public, most schools, universities, and colleges require you to publish, so they publish as a means to be able to keep teaching.
Right. Right.
I was definitely in the first category.
Well, the other way I think of you, David, is I've often thought of is that there are professors, we well know them, who prefer to talk to other professors.
Yeah.
Then there are professors who can talk to other professors or write to them, but then also students. But then there's a third level. We call them public intellectuals, I think, today. Can a professor not only do good and trailblazing research that's legit and also teach students, but then also reach the general public? That's a lot harder to do. I know, and you're really good at all 3 of them. And I mean, I mentioned the Barron's essays. Perfect example of you're a really smart guy, but how do you explain inflation to a reader that's an investor class or something like that, and they claim to know a lot about inflation? Those were mostly political, economic, social essays. They were just fabulous. But but they're coming from a philosopher. And I said, but, right? And most people say, but how can a philosopher knows all this stuff about reality? It was just great. Great. So
I don't think he's had any other philosophers on writing for them.
I'm curious, the student, I've experienced the same thing. If the students aren't really advanced, it's hard to teach to them and learn for yourself. When you started speaking at objectivist conferences, did you feel like the audience was a little smarter and got you more interested again, or no?
Yes, the objectivist conferences like the Jefferson School that we attended back in the day. There were people of all ages, but definitely students, also some retired people, but there were a lot of professionals in between who, loved the ideas. What I found was, that was often, great questions, during a lecture or after a lecture, or just in conversation around the conference.
Yeah.
But the context was different because they were interested in the ideas of objectivism. It didn't necessarily have the analytic context, or the academic context, that I need to take account of when I'm writing philosophy.
Yeah.
So there was, and sometimes I would, I have to admit, I got a little impatient with it when. There were a lot of simple laugh lines, trashing Keynes or, Plato.
Like a stand-up comedian knows, this they're going to giggle at this. I've done this before. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
It's almost it gets too easy. You mean that at that point?
It does. You have to be. If you're a good speaker, that you got to speak to your audience, and that means having a sense of their context and what will interest them.
Yeah.
So it was not particularly a problem, but I thought what I was always most interested in was, how do I teach them something new that's obviously objectivist, but not something that they might not have thought of before.
Yes.
The people who attend the conferences are there. They're not getting credit for it. They're out of interest.
Right. But at the same time, I remember when I was at those conferences, I was kind of biased toward, unless I saw them in academia, unless they were a student, moving toward a degree, I couldn't find the motivation to get to the level we were teaching at.
Mm-hmm.
Nice to help the general audience, but they're, as we say, are not the capital goods that produce future intellectuals. And I know I know from your history, you've been interested not only in the ideas, but how ideas are disseminated and how movements work or don't work. It's really a specialty when you think about the role of philosophy in history, or what moves the world, or how certain group, fascinating stuff you've written there. Let's fast forward a little bit about, let me ask a more abstract question instead of getting into the weeds. Ayn Rand's philosophy, and then Ayn Rand's life and the way she lived it. Some people have trouble reconciling the two, and I don't think you did. I think your view was she has a biography. It's a fascinating biography. It's a really amazing, it's a Hollywood tale to be told, right? Russia to the Empire State Building, but foibles and weird things happen. But does that detract from the philosophy? Were you pretty much always able to say, listen, there's a philosophy here, and I'm not perturbed or set aside by certain personality traits or biographies. It doesn't make me reject the philosophy or look at it. How would you just look at, a philosopher's philosophy and then a philosopher's life, and someone saying, hey, you're not living up to your philosophy, therefore it's not true? Kind of an ad hominem, isn't it? But what thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's definitely an ad hominem, and I've heard that so many times. And when I'm debating or just on a panel with someone who says that, I always call them out on it, because it's a straightforward logical fallacy. But there's something much deeper than the logic. When there were things I wondered about in the objectivist movement, but I was never centrally involved I mean, I was involved. I was even after the Unrugged Institute was formed. I was on their speakers bureau. I was going around giving talks, and actually they helped fund a semester, or the Foundation for the New Intellectual helped provided funding for a semester off from Vassar so I could write.
Yeah.
But there was always, the sense, this background. It's like they talk about the, what is it? The background radiation from the Big Bang. It's just, you detect it only in certain circumstances, but it's just always kind of there. It was something like that, was the sense of, there's a tendency toward dogmatism and excluding people. And for a while I thought, well, we're past that. And then Barbara Brandon's book came out. And actually, I mean, this was 3 years before, the split, and the split really had nothing to do with Barbara's book. But I read it, and I talked about the book. I didn't see eye to eye with Leonard that it was awful and malicious. And I had conversations with a lot of other people. And it started me thinking about something that was the beginning of what became Truth and Toleration. And that was the concept of idolatry. Mm-hmm. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, God says, no graven images, you have no God before me. Right. He struck down the gold, everything, or Moses did. But, the essence of it is you're identifying a concrete object in the world with a transcendent being. Yes. And you can make an analogy, which I did in Truth and Toleration, with the secular system, where the ideas, the philosophy of objectivism is not identical with Ayn Rand. Yeah. But I began thinking when I was looking at the reaction to Barbara's book, that people were saying, if Ayn Rand is flawed, then the philosophy is not right. But if the philosophy is right, we can't acknowledge any flaws. So like a false alternative there. Yeah, exactly. And so that got me thinking about, what the philosophy was, and in my mind, separating it a little more clearly from the movement, as well as her person. And so one thing led to another, but that was my first really, I thought that there's something wrong here. So this opens up a couple of avenues. One, the issue of open objectivism versus closed. But I just want to focus on a more positive treatment, make sure we get this on the record. There is a fabulous, I don't have to tell you what section I'm talking about, but it's really not well known section of Truth and Toleration, where you I can tell this was a lot of work. You scrupulously go through and explain what you think are the core essential principles of objectivism in all the branches. And interestingly, excluding aesthetics, because she did herself when she was asked, give me a thumbnail sketch in all I think the opening essay, What is Objectivism, in one of her books. And she gives very thumbnail sketches, right, of each branch. Uh-huh. And that's really important, right? Because if objectivism is everything she ever wrote or said, some stuff she said was just really marginal. Yeah. Dubious. We don't have to say what they are, but that's too big a task, right? To say that's what objectivism is. And maybe objectivism, capital O, yes, we can certainly circumscribe everything she said and wrote. Mm-hmm. But your view, I think, if it's going to be a growing, fruitful, expanding philosophy, you do need to start with that core, right? Because if you don't embrace the core principles, you're probably not an objectivist. So I'll stop there. Say more about
was that hard to do when you had to sit down and say, now I'm going to tell you what the core is, and this is the core, and that's not the core? Was that hard?
It was very hard. I can't remember how much time I spent on it, but I agonized over think about, okay, well, if I wanted to define communism, what would that be like? Or existentialism, how do those things function? And because they are the, that's how you do a definition or any kind of analysis. You're trying to identify the nature of something, and you compare it with other things that are in the same genus but different on substantive things.
But you're using logic. You're using your logic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I put that out, and it was my best judgment as a philosopher who knew objectivism really well and knew something about the history of philosophy as well.
Right. You needed both.
Yeah. I expected people to say, well, I think you should have included this or that.
Yeah.
No one said anything.
That would have been a healthy exchange.
Yeah. Yes.
And so, it would have, go ahead. Yeah.
So what I noticed people doing was picking on something that I used to illustrate. I think the example was honesty is a virtue, right? On my list of the essentials was rationality is a virtue. Yeah. I think that that entails honesty, and I can give you the argument for that. But if someone says, well, there are certain business situations in which our understanding of honesty has to be changed.
Right.
Fine. Even if someone thought that the theory of measurement omission as the process by which we form concepts, even if someone says, there's a problem with this, my response would be, okay, let's solve the problem. Let's find a better theory. But the core is concepts reflect reality. Concepts are about reality. They're objective. So as long as that core is intact, there are a lot of things that could be studied further, elaborated, modified. I have a few. There are very few things I disagree with the Brand's writings about. Mostly what I feel is, okay, what'd she mean? And that's what ARI scholars do. I know a lot of the books they published are about how to interpret, this body of work in ethics, whatever.
But but you and I know that something open to interpretation is not dogma. So let's not treat it as dogma or scripture or it strikes me, I think you and I have talked about this before, it strikes me as very interesting that in her theory of concept formation, the issue of the essentials in a definition or in a concept, and getting to the essential, the thing that most explains all other attributes, why can that not be applied to the concept of objectivism itself? It's got essentials, it's got derivatives. At some point, it has derivatives like, no president could be a woman. That's, highly disputable. So if you disagree with that, it's hard to say you're not an objectivist. So I think to speak about, David, also the issue of whether open and closed pertains, say, to content, method, application, but also the issue of who you talk to, who you try to convince, who you try to persuade. And if I recall the sequencing right, that was the first objections people had, that not that you were diluting objectivism or adulterating it, because you weren't, but it was more the idea of, we don't talk to our enemies. And then the enemies list was kind of long and weird. Yeah. Talk about that a little bit. The idea that open kind of also means, reaching out to, possible converts, and are we sanctioning them, or are they just hearing us out? Your philosophy on that and how it differed in the early days from others.
Well, I went to graduate school, then I went to teach at Vassar. I had colleagues. We had conversations about philosophy. We had little department symposia where someone would deliver a paper or read a paper and talk about it. Yeah. I was used to that. That's what that, and I'm in any healthy field discipline, that's how people normally function when they're not at each other's throats.
Yeah.
But the and that's how I thought the objectivism movement was functioning. I mean, before 1989, I guess, when I was first attacked for talking to a libertarian group.
Right.
What I felt at the time and what I wrote in the initial short piece called The Question of Sanction was, look, not of agreeing with someone and not of ignoring moral failures, but the difference in ideas, that should be an opportunity for discussion, debate, outreach. And it, and then I said, after all, objectivism is an open philosophy.
Yeah.
I've said many times, I thought that was a throwaway line. I just thought, reminding people of what we all understand. I was stunned when it turned out people didn't believe that. But yeah, so now I think part of open objectivism, I would incorporate a sense of benevolence that I think toleration, the incentive for it,
yes,
is, I mean, it's a particular form of benevolence that is focused on learning and intellectual engagement.
Right.
But that's an important part of our lives. I mean, for everybody, not just intellectuals. And so it means being open to new ideas, open to inquiry, and open to discussion and debate with people who don't.
Yeah. And after,
because we may learn. And
yeah. I mean, it's not difficult after a while to see whether someone's just not open to persuasion, but the idea that we give someone the benefit of the doubt just sounds like benevolence. And there would be some people, I suppose, who say, listen, I'm just going to study this philosophy kind of scholastically. I'm going to stay within the text. I'm going to become an expert in the text. I'm going to talk to others who know the texts. And I can see there's a certain interest people would have with that. But if you're interested in advancing the ideas, that's not going to do it, right? You're going to look for a small enclave of people, and it starts actually sounding academic-y in the sense of scholastic, internal, insular. But I think you've always been interested in the idea of persuading, and in many ways it's more difficult, isn't it, David? I mean, it's easier to talk to people who are using the same jargon. I mean, you and I have been in academia; we know how that works. Yeah, and it has that way in objectivism, and so it's not for everybody. But the idea of, I know all this technical stuff, and you do, and I know the core of objectivism, and you do, but then now go try to explain it to a conservative or a libertarian. So someone who's in our orbit, but not quite in our orbit, and not quite able to defend either reason or capital. That's more difficult. Isn't that more difficult? Well, also more fun, but in many ways it's more difficult, isn't it? It's not.
It's much more difficult. Yeah. I mean, one of the things relates to some of the other things we talked about, but I have always been interested in advocacy and persuasion and in cultural and political realms, as well as just pure inquiry and discovery. Right. So, there's some people who are just intellectuals that they all they care about is discovery. But I've been doing that, pretty much all my life. And even when I was at Vassar, I was writing for Barron's and other places. And if you're going to engage in that, you have to have, invite people. They, not many people will respond if you start out by denouncing them as evil for holding certain ideas. I mean, that's kind of a non-starter conversationally. And
or converting errors of knowledge into, you must be dishonest.
Yeah.
If you don't see that, it's not my job to inform you, but to moralize against you. It's almost too easy. That's not the real objection to it, but it's something like that. To impugn motives right away. It's almost like a cheap way out. But also I think, David, that once you say, and I'll never forget, you used the word, I'm a polemicist. You used that in one of your 1989 things. And people think that's a bad thing, like it's combative. But if you look it up, it just means interest in persuading others and debating them. It's got a fully innocuous connotation as far as I'm concerned. But some people aren't really good at that. I mean, to hold your cool in a debate, to think on your feet, to try to bridge what is this person thinking and why are they objecting to capitalism? Why are they sticking to religion? I mean, all the things you have to keep track of, and then reach out to persuade. Some people aren't good at it, so they just get emotional and then resort to ad hominem. So you feel that way, I'm sure, too. When you do this, it's not only fun and challenging, but you got to keep your cool as well. Stick to the rules of logic and not resort to fallacies and all the stuff you learned when you were a kid.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that really helps, that objectivism helps with in that respect, is that, the ultimate criterion is reality and truth.
Reality. That's the judge in the room. That's the arbiter.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
And however stupid or even malevolent I think of someone's ideas are, it doesn't impugn, first of all, it doesn't change reality.
And it's no threat to you.
It's no threat to me either. Right. And that's the lack of threat. And that's what I think objectivism is a real help for if you're in this world of discussion and debate out there and polemics, because, disagreement is not a threat to you. It can be an opportunity, or it can be, if someone's unreachable, you just walk away. But people say, if I can't convince you, that means something wrong with me.
Yeah, there's an insecurity. There's an insecurity there. Either you don't really fully know your argument, or you place too much credence on the idea of agreement among minds is really the basis of knowledge, which is, that's not the correspondence theory of truth. That's the coherence, the spirit theory of truth.
Yes.
Unrugged Individualism, a fabulous book as well. What motivated that? The idea that people just weren't seeing the value, the selfish value, as you put it, of benevolence. Well, why do they not see benevolence as, of selfish value to people?
Well, I wrote that in the mid 1990s.
Yes, right.
So, and first gave it as a summer seminar lecture. And things have been rolling around in my mind, partly just thinking about the way I behave toward people, and the way people I liked, treated each other, and also just began thinking more and more about, does this have a place in objectivism?
Yes.
And we had decided that the topic for that year's, the 1995 summer seminar, was going to be civilization. I thought, okay, this is a form of civility, and now's my chance. Now's my chance.
Right.
So, and I just began trying to be systematic about some of the thoughts I've been rolling around for years, and one of the amazing things was going through the Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged and seeing how many instances.
Oh yes.
And and it probably was motivated by one of the most common, if not the most common, assault on objectivism. Well, you're promoting self-interest. That's selfish.
Yeah.
And people are applying their normal sense of selfishness.
Right.
And we can get our backs up and say, no, you don't understand what we mean by selfish. But how about instead of that negative reply, which is perfectly valid, how about adding the positive thing? No, we believe in benevolence. We just don't think it's different from altruism. And once you make that distinction, a lot of people get it. I think a lot of people get it. I remember back in the early 90s, Hillary Clinton had developed this whole takeover of medicine.
Yeah.
Hillary Care.
Yeah, I remember.
And so I wrote this talk called "Is There a Right to Healthcare?"
Yeah.
And not to go into too much detail, but when I was giving that to a conference of doctors, I just said, I made a distinction between, the generosity of doctors, the astounding generosity that physicians of all kinds have always extended, and the duty to serve people. And I swear, these were all conservative
Right.
groups, so no big surprise, but they were, it was like the clouds parted.
Yeah, right.
See it.
Yeah, that's nice. That's a nice feeling. Yeah, that's a nice feeling. I think we only have a few more minutes, David. So I could talk to you for 3 hours more about these things. We do that privately.
Yes, right.
We've been known to do that. I just have to make a kind of declarative statement. Your method has been adopted. I mean, when I look at objectivism today, there are people trying to add to the philosophy, amend, extend, apply. There's many who formerly said it was closed are talking about, whole new volumes need to be written to elaborate and explain this or that. And the second part of it, outreach to others, without sacrificing your principles. I think you paved the way. You haven't always been, maybe never been credited for that, but I just want to say that as a declarative thing. That's what I've noticed. That's what a lot of others on the Atlas Society have noticed, and I congratulate you for that. But I myself came late to it, really late to it, way too late. But I'm glad I'm here now. But it's really quite an achievement, David, because to the extent that's happened at all, I think you blazed the trail. It's just amazing. And so I wanted to leave with a question. Really, I mentioned this earlier because I think you're very fascinating in the sense you have this deep technical knowledge in epistemology, but then also this deep knowledge of objectivism, but then also a theory of movement, a theory of how, you've written on Christianity and Marxism and when you get a leader and what is it like when they're alive and what happens after when they have apostles and what goes wrong or what goes, these are major things that have influenced the world, right? Christianity, Marxism. Yeah. We hope that 100 years from now, we're including objectivism in that name of those things. So looked at that way, what would be your kind of summary assessment of where the movement is, where it's going, and application to America's future? What's your assessment generally on objectivism and its role in the future?
Well, it's very hard to say. I've never been good at predicting.
Right.
And as I said in one conference, sort of depends whether you see the glass as 1/4 full or 3/4 full.
Right. That's funny.
I try to be up years and of this being my job, full-time job, and 60 years since Rand was writing, 60 more. The ideas, there has been a huge impact. Atlas Shrugged and Fountain are still selling gazillions back in the financial crisis in 2008. They went through the roof. And so people are reading the books, and probably it's only a small fraction that get arrested by the ideas, by the system.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the way our culture is moving, the academic and now, the political and social and even business contexts are so imbued with bad ideas, with identity politics and the primacy of equality. I've run out of new stuff to say. So I don't know. I think it will take, people who are smarter about this than I am to make that change. I would just say that I think in the academic realm where we're ignored, but not always with the same degree of political hostility, but because Ayn Rand's her it is so different. I've always thought what galvanizes intellectuals is someone who opens up a fertile field for further research and development. I mean,
Yeah.
you know how that works. And objectivism has, but we haven't made that clear to the thinkers, clear enough anyway. But also, I think, I don't know. We see young people coming in. Jennifer Grossman, started CEO now for 6 years, has really drawn a huge following among younger people, and following for objectivism for the Atlas Society. And so the way history works, there's movement and counter movement, and counter movement. And a lot depends on the individuals who can attract and galvanize people's attention. We need more of them. But
I think equivalent to what you said, David, about arguing with someone and the confidence you have in the back of your mind. Well, reality really is the arbiter sitting in the judge's chair here. I needn't get defensive about anything. I think you do too. I feel the same way about objectivism. There are a lot of personalities in this movement. There are a lot of personalities that don't get along, and that's to be expected. We're supposed to be individualists, right? But what's the arbiter in the room? The philosophy itself. What is the core of it? What does it really mean? And you go from there, and may the best man and woman in argument win. I think even the fact that there are competing objectivist groups could be a sign of that's a good thing. That's a good thing. We specialize in different things. We don't all have to get along, but attention to reality and attention to the philosophy is everything. We have to wrap up. And David, I cannot thank you enough. I think that I speak for hundreds of thousands who think you've plowed these fields and made it fertile for the philosophy to expand and grow. I think if you had not done this, it might be dying on the vine. I mean, it's a really amazing 3-decade story. It's still being written. I think you guys are growing faster than ever. And it's just a wonderful story. And you're still intellectually active. People know that. People see you. It's a wonderful, inspirational thing for many of us. I just wanted you to know that. So.
Well, thank you, Richard. I appreciate it. And
we love you for all that you've done in that regard. Just really great stuff. Really great.
Well, thank you so much. And I must say, from my semi-retired position, I love being watching what's happening and not having to do it all. Do as much.
It's time for others to pick up the shovels, David, and start. And the hammers and the building materials, and move on and build on your shoulders and others. So thank you, David. I want to thank all of you also for listening in today. I hope you enjoyed it. Tell others about it. If you enjoyed it and any of the other materials from the Atlas Society, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution. Go to atlassociety.org. Also get on the mailing list when you go there. Visit the events page. You'll see events like this and others almost every day. Really good stuff, webinars and things like that. I'm told that the next Atlas Society special discussion will be, well, I must know because I'm in on it, the Russia-Ukraine war Friday. But really the one after that, I've heard Robert Bryce before. It'll be Robert Bryce. He's an energy expert. He's just fabulous. So he's coming next and he'll be next. So look out for that. David, thank you again. We love you. We love what you're doing. And thank you so much for sharing all your ideas and thoughts. Thank you, David.
Thanks. Thank you, Richard.